Hello students. Today we're going to talk about the brain and the cranial nerves in chapter 14. Just make sure throughout the video, again, emphasize these links for the animations. But as far as the principal parts of the brain are concerned, the largest mass of the brain is called the cerebrum. The second largest mass of the brain is called the cerebellum. There is an area called the brain stem, which includes three separate parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and something called the midbrain. There's also the diencephalon, which in the middle of the brain, which is made up of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and something called the epithalamus up here, where we also have a gland called the pineal gland, which we'll talk about. The brain, like the spinal cord that we covered in chapter 13, is protected by several structures. The brain is, as you well know, surrounded by the cranial bones, part of the cranium and in the skull. There are connective tissue membranes that surround the brain, as the same ones that surrounded the spinal cord, the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. And then we're going to talk about cerebrospinal fluid and where it's made and where it circulates in and around the brain. So the meninges that surround the brain basically help protect the brain, and you can see here in a frontal section of the brain through the cranial the cranium into the cranial cavity enlarged. The dura mater is a tough, dense outer layer of connective tissue that surrounds the brain and anchors it in the cranial cavity. Unlike the spinal cord, the dura mater in the cranial cavity surrounding the brain is actually made up of two thick layers of connective tissue. Just deep to that is the arachnoid mater, and the arachnoid mater is separated from the pia mater, which is outlined in this little red line that you see here. Separated from that with this space is called the subarachnoid space. We then have little extensions of the arachnoid mater that go into what is referred to as dural sinuses. This one happens to be what is called the superior sagittal sinus that runs along the top of the brain inside the cranium, in the cranial cavity, and these structures are involved in reabsorbing cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space back into venous blood. So this will be the venous blood flow up here that will ultimately exit the brain to recirculate in the body. There are some important extensions of the dura mater that we should be made aware of. First, there is something called the falx cerebri. This is a connective tissue layer that separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres from one another. If we look at a frontal section down here, you can see the left and the right cerebral hemispheres a little bit up here, and then they're separated from each other by the falx cerebri. The falx cerebelli separates the hemispheres of the cerebellum, which is the second largest mass of the brain. And then we have something called the tentorium cerebelli right here that helps separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So these are connective tissue structures that extend from the dura mater that help separate the main parts of the brain from one another. The brain tissue itself does not have blood flowing all through the neurons and the neuroglial and the tissue in the brain. There's something called the blood-brain barrier. I think in chapter 12, if you review that, you'll notice one of the neuroglial cells called the astrocytes. Their function was to produce what is called a blood-brain barrier. So substances that are in the blood do not have direct access to the brain tissue. The astrocytes forming the blood-brain barrier, selects what types of substances can pass from the blood to the brain. And this is more of a protective mechanism. There are three main structures in the brain that do not have a blood-brain barrier. We will cover those shortly. Now, since blood does not flow through the brain tissue, all of the cells that form the brain tissue, which are the neurons and the neuroglial cells, have to get the oxygen and the glucose, the ions, and other important nutrients that they need to live from what is called cerebrospinal fluid. So you could think of cerebrospinal fluid more like the blood for the central nervous system. I hate saying it that way, but you might understand it a little better that way. So we have the blood flowing through our body for all the cells in the body, but the brain and the spinal cord is serviced by this cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is going to carry the nutrients to the neurons and the neuroglial cells and carry their waste products back away out of the brain, in this case, or in the spinal cord as well. So the brain has cavities in it, which are called ventricles. Here you see a transverse plane of the brain. Over here, if we cut the brain in the transverse plane and look down into it, you can see the middle of the cerebral hemispheres have this cavity. These cavities are referred to as ventricles, and inside the ventricles we have special capillary beds that are associated with ependymal cells, which is a neuroglial cell involved in the production of cerebrospinal fluid, and they're located, these choroid plexuses are located in the ventricles. So the choroid plexus contains special capillaries surrounded by these ependymal cells, and the ependymal cells have the job of filtering plasma from the blood and producing the fluid which we call cerebrospinal fluid. So as these cells produce this fluid, it flows inside of the ventricle. So let's look at the direction in which cerebrospinal fluid flows through basically the central nervous system. So the choroid plexuses, the blood capillaries with the ependymal cells, are located in the ventricles. The ones that we just saw from the last picture is called the lateral ventricles. They're in each of the cerebral hemispheres. Here's a sagittal section through the brain. So inside of here is the lateral ventricle for the left cerebral hemisphere, and there would be one for the right as well. There's also a third ventricle which surrounds something called the interthalamic adhesion, or in some books it's referred to as the intermediate mass of the thalamus. That's a little cavity with choroid plexus in it. That's called the third ventricle. And then down here is a fourth ventricle, just anterior to the cerebellum. And each one of these ventricles contains a choroid plexus that produces cerebrospinal fluid. Now the cerebrospinal fluid is going to flow from the lateral ventricles. Let me backtrack. So here's a lateral ventricle, the hole that is in each of the cerebral hemispheres. So right at the anterior area of the lateral ventricle is something called the interventricular foramen, or foramina plural. So from the lateral ventricles, the cerebrospinal fluid flows through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, which surrounds the intermediate mass of the thalamus, or the interthalamic adhesion, will flow through what's called the cerebral aqueduct, which is located on this picture right here. So the cerebrospinal fluid comes out of the lateral ventricle through the foramen into the third ventricle. Then it will flow down the cerebral aqueduct, which is at the dorsal side of the midbrain, which we'll get to in a minute, and then into the fourth ventricle. So here's the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, there's a couple of apertures, or holes if you will, that allow the cerebrospinal fluid to go into one of two places. So from the fourth ventricle, the CSF, as it's called, will go through lateral ventricles and what's called a median aperture. A lateral and median apertures. Through these apertures, the CSF will flow into the subarachnoid space, which surrounds the cerebellum. It surrounds the cerebrum. It even surrounds the outside of the midbrain, the brainstem, and the outside of the spinal cord. But the spinal cord, if you remember from chapter 13, is hollow. There's a central canal down the middle. So cerebrospinal fluid can also enter the central canal. So the CSF is actually circulating just on the outside of our brain and on the outside of the spinal cord in what's called the subarachnoid space. And it also flows inside the ventricles of the brain itself, as well as a central canal of the spinal cord. Now, once the CSF circulates around the brain, in the ventricles, and around the spinal cord and whatnot, and all the cells get the nutrients they need to live, all of that used up CSF, so to speak, with waste products in it, is reabsorbed back into a venous blood flow in what's called a dural sinus. So this is venous blood flow up here. This actually would be the superior sagittal sinus up here, and it flows back into the blood via what's called an arachnoid villus or arachnoid villi plural. In that way, cerebrospinal fluid is always being produced from the choroid plexus, circulates around the central nervous system, and then it is reabsorbed back into the venous blood flow to go back out to the body so we can get rid of the waste products and then reoxygenate that blood. So you just follow this flow chart to help you out with the direction in which CSF is flowing. Here's a system overview for the nervous system. I urge you to watch that animation. And we're going to get into the parts of the brain. So the first part of the brain that we're going to cover is called the brainstem. It's actually composed of 3 sections, and if we look on this picture, this is an inferior view of the brain, so it's like we're looking underneath it. We have the medulla oblongata, which is right here, something called the pons, and then an area called the midbrain. So we're going to talk about each one of these in turn. The medulla oblongata is continuous with the most superior portion of the spinal cord, which was obviously covered in chapter 13. So extending from the spinal cord up to where the pons would be, which would be right above here, that's called the medulla. Now, the medulla contains a couple of things of interest here. Number one, I'm going to talk about these pyramids. These pyramids right here, or what we call pyramidal tracts, are tracts of motor neurons coming from the cerebral cortex. And we still have to talk about that. But these motor neurons come down from the cerebral cortex down through our brain, ultimately to enter the spinal cord, and they control skeletal muscle function. But notice, in the medulla, a large number of the bands or tracts from the pyramidal tracts cross over each other from the left side of the brain to the right side of the brain and vice versa. There's a few that run down the same side of the brain from which they originate, but about 85% of the axons cross over in the medulla at an area called the decussation of pyramids. So this decussation of pyramids, or crossing over here, is of some interest because ultimately the right side of your cerebrum controls the left side of your body's skeletal muscles, and the left side of your cerebrum controls the right side of your body's skeletal muscle. So basically your right arm and leg is mainly controlled by the left cerebral hemisphere and vice versa, which is of some interest there. So we have the pyramidal tracts. We also have the inferior olivary nuclei, which are involved in particular reflexes that help coordinate muscle skeletal muscle contraction. But overall, there are special centers in the medulla that we get into in a little more detail in A&P2. But located in the medulla oblongata are the centers that regulate cardiac activity, regulate respiratory activity, is involved in vasoconstriction, which is a decrease in vessel diameter. Swallowing, coughing, vomiting, and sneezing and hiccuping reflexes are also all initiated from the medulla oblongata. The pons is superior to the medulla. It's a little bit larger than the medulla oblongata, and it actually links various parts of the brain to each other. It contains sensory neurons coming in and motor neurons coming out, which they don't really show. We'll talk about the reticular formation in a minute, but it's a major relay area. So is the medulla. Tracks coming in, tracks coming out from the various parts of the brain that we have to talk about. So the pons ultimately controls several different things, but it's involved in skeletal muscle movement, helping coordinate the information to and from the cerebrum to the cerebellum to allow a coordinated skeletal muscle action in our body. And we'll talk about that coordination when we do the cerebellum in a minute. But along with the medulla oblongata, the pons also contain some centers that are involved in controlling respiration. The midbrain is just superior to the pons. It's actually made up of, at the dorsal side of it, something called the tectum, which is the roof of the midbrain. The roof of the midbrain contains 4 little nodules of nervous tissue. Those nodules collectively together are referred to as the corpora quadrigemina. Quadra because there's 4 rounded elevations. 2 of them are superior elevations and 2 of them are inferior, so they're referred to as the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi are involved in the reflexes that process visual stimulation. So reflexes associated with visual sensory input is controlled by the superior colliculi, and the inferior colliculi regulate reflexes associated with auditory stimulation, or when you're hearing something. So for instance, if someone comes up behind you and claps their hand real loud and you didn't know they were there, you probably would turn around real quick. That noise that you hear and the action of turning around is partly initiated by the inferior colliculi. Rather, the superior colliculi would bring about reflexes similarly, but would be associated with visual inputs. So if you saw something that startled you, you would react to it due to the superior colliculi. And then we have this pineal gland that lies at the superior portion of the superior colliculi. We're going to talk about that in a second. So the midbrain itself contains some structures referred to as the cerebral peduncles. You can't see them from this picture because this is the dorsal view of the picture. The cerebral peduncles can be seen from the anterior view of the midbrain, and they are shown here, but this is in a transverse plane. So if we were looking at it from a transverse plane, these are called the cerebral peduncles. The cerebral peduncles coordinate the movement, or really the transmission of motor and sensory impulses back and forth to different parts of the brain. And then we up and down the spinal, to and from the spinal cord. And then we talked about the corpora quadrigemina already. This is that name I was referring to with the 4 rounded elevations called the superior and the inferior colliculi. So the midbrain conveys motor impulses from the cerebrum to the cerebellum and to the spinal cord, as well as sending sensory information from the spinal cord to the thalamus, which we have to talk about. and regulates auditory and visual reflexes, ultimately because of the corpora quadrigemina. Remember, the superior colliculi are for visual reflexes, and then the inferior colliculi are for auditory reflexes. And we'll talk about the thalamus and what it does here in a second. Now, the reticular formation, which extends through most of the brainstem, and obviously you can see here it's taking up some of the medulla, the pons, and into the midbrain. The reticular formation is composed of neurons that transmit information to the cerebral cortex about sensory signals that you may be encountering. So there's a sensory input to the cerebral cortex from the reticular formation. It's also the part of our unconscious brain, which I forgot to mention. The brain stem is our unconscious brain, as well as the cerebellum. So the reticular formation is involved in helping you stay awake, maintaining consciousness, or in the morning when you are awakening from sleep. The reason why you wake up is because of signals from the reticular formation. So I put in throughout the PowerPoint these slides that show the parts of the brain with their functions. So you need to make sure you go through where I have these and just review their functions. As I'm not mentioning every single function, what I want you to know will be in these particular locations on these slides. The medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain all make up what is called the brain stem. So know those parts and their particular major functions. The cerebellum is the second largest mass of the brain. It located in the inferior and posterior part of your cranial cavity. It is made up of two hemispheres. They're called the cerebellar hemispheres. We have a left cerebellar hemisphere and a right cerebellar hemisphere, and in between them is something called the vermis that separates them. Just deep to that is the falx cerebelli that I was mentioning before, which helps separate partially the cerebellar hemispheres from one another. Now, the cerebellum is also part of our unconscious brain. We don't have conscious control from our cerebellum. Some of its major roles involve skeletal muscle coordination, the maintenance of muscle tone, your posture, and balance. So ultimately, we have signals that come from our cerebrum, which I'm going to mention in a minute, that directly control skeletal muscle contraction. But information about those skeletal muscles contracting is rerouted to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum runs a checklist, if you will. Was the muscle that was contracting generating the appropriate reflex or not? Or do we need to make adjustments in muscle contraction in order to maintain posture and balance? Consider this. If you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you didn't see a pothole and you stepped into it and you look down and you're already stepping into it, you automatically have a reflex to adjust your muscles so that you don't fall. Now, we know that doesn't always work, but you will adjust muscle contraction to try to prevent you from falling, because your intended muscle contraction was just to walk straight. It wasn't to walk into a hole. So our cerebellum is involved in that coordination, if that makes sense to you. The cerebellum also has white matter and gray matter, as does the cerebrum, which we'll talk about. The white matter, if we look at this transverse mid-sagittal section of the cerebellum, the white matter inside the cerebellum is referred to as the arbor vitae. The arbor vitae is the white matter, so that's all myelinated neuron parts. And then the gray matter extends into the cerebellar cortex. And the cerebellar cortex has all of these miniature folds in it, and these miniature folds are referred to as folia. So the cerebellar cortex contains all of the gray matter, which obviously is unmyelinated neuron cell parts. The diencephalon is a box in the middle of our cerebral hemispheres. It's made up of three things, something called the thalamus. Below it is what we call the hypothalamus. And then I know they don't show, but they do show it. Right around the posterior to the superior portion of the thalamus is what's called the epithalamus, and that is where the pineal gland is located. So we have to talk about these three parts of what's called the diencephalon. And again, the diencephalon forms a box in the middle of our cerebral hemispheres. So here's just a little graphic. You don't have to identify anything on these pictures. I use them just to show you where the structures are located. But you can see they projected to the surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the cerebrum. We haven't talked about it yet. And deep in there is what we call the thalamus. So here's a mid-sagittal view. They took off the right cerebral hemisphere, and there would be one of the lobes of the thalamus with the interthalamic adhesion, or sometimes called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. So here's what the thalamus looks like. It's made of these two lobes, a left lobe, thalamic lobe, and a right thalamic lobe that are interconnected by this interthalamic adhesion, or the intermediate mass of the thalamus. The thalamus is superior to the midbrain, and it serves as a major relay station for all sensory input. All the sensations you can think about that you would feel, and even some unconsciously perceived sensations that we haven't talked about, are processed through the thalamus, except for olfaction, or the sense of smell. That's the only sensation that is not processed through our thalamus. So the thalamus is a major relay station for our sensory inputs. There are also some motor outputs that are important dealing with the autonomic nervous system that come from the thalamus and down to what's called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus are collections of nuclei down below the thalamus. So here's the thalamic lobe. This would be the left thalamic lobe embedded in the left cerebral hemisphere. Here's the interthalamic adhesion, or intermediate mass of the thalamus right here. The hypothalamus has four major regions that's all involved in controlling reflexes that regulate almost all homeostatic conditions in our body. So we're not going to go over all four of the major regions of the hypothalamus, but we're going to learn what the hypothalamus does in general. All right. So before I show you that slide with the functions on it, let's talk about the epithalamus. The epithalamus lies superior and just posterior to the thalamus. So here's the thalamic lobe. The epithalamus is up at the top and extends downward a little bit to the posterior section of it. The epithalamus contains the pineal gland, which produces melatonin. And you may have heard of that before. You can buy melatonin as a supplement, as a sleep aid. So melatonin is a hormone that helps set our biological clock, which is referred to as the circadian rhythms. We talk a lot more about that in A&P2, but for now, you just know that it basically is a hormone that globally sets our cycles of activity and our cycles of rest, which is called our circadian rhythm. The Habener nucleus is also located in the epithalamus down here, and is involved in the sense of smell, which is olfaction. Now, there are three important areas around the diencephalon that do not have a blood-brain barrier. These three structures collectively together are referred to as the circumventricular organs because they circle around the ventricles that's around the diencephalon. So the circumventricular organs are around the diencephalon. Since they lack a blood-brain barrier, they also are very important in monitoring chemical changes of the blood that can help initiate reflexes like respiratory reflexes, cardiovascular reflexes, to maintain homeostasis in our body. So these organs are involved in both endocrine and nervous system reflexes, and they include the hypothalamus itself, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. So all three of these structures are involved in maintaining and regulating the reflexes in the body initiated by the endocrine system, which is a system of hormones in the body, and nervous system reflexes. So here is a chart that shows the three portions of the diencephalon. Again, review them for their functions and know that the diencephalon is made up of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Now, let's get to the largest mass of the brain, the cerebrum. The cerebrum is composed of two cerebral hemispheres. There is white matter and there is gray matter. The gray matter of the cerebrum is located in what's referred to as the cerebral cortex, contains billions of neurons associated with the gray matter, and the cerebrum can be divided into certain regions and structures. For instance, the cerebrum has folds in it that project in and outward. The folds are referred to as gyri, that's plural. Gyrus would be singular. There are fissures or separations between parts of the brain. The little areas that separate one gyrus from another one is referred to as a sulcus or sulci, plural, and some of these can be identified on the brain. Now, deep to the cerebral cortex is where the white matter is located. The white matter are tracts of myelinated neurons that connect each part of the brain together and the brain to the spinal cord directly. There's a deep connection between the cerebral hemispheres called the corpus callosum that connects the right and left cerebral hemispheres together. If you look at this graphic, you can see the gray matter on the outside of the cerebrum. This is referred to as the cerebral cortex. This actually makes up our conscious brain, and we'll talk about that in a second. We have a fissure which separates. The longitudinal fissure in this case that you see right here separates the left cerebral hemisphere from the right cerebral hemisphere. The gyri are these folds that we see in the cerebral cortex, and the little separation that goes down between each gyrus is called a sulcus. The cerebrum itself is separated into lobes. The frontal lobe up here, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobes, and the temporal lobes, which we can't see from this view because we're looking at a superior portion of the brain. Oh, here we can see it much better. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So each lobe contains special sets of neurons which are involved with controlling different aspects of our body. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, where you see things, smell things, taste things, stuff like that. We're going to talk a little bit about. The insula is deep to the cerebral cortex and each cerebral hemisphere. The artist of this picture kind of projected it outward so we can see it, but it really is covered up by the frontal, parietal, and the temporal lobe. Here's a real picture of the brain, a sagittal view of the mid-sagittal view of the brain. White matter tracks right here. The gyri of the brain with the sulcus right here. This is the cerebral cortex where the gray matter is located. This is where you think, you learn, you control things consciously, you feel things all around the body. This is where you feel and manipulate, you learn, all of that consciously. This is our conscious brain, the cerebral cortex. Now, the basal nuclei are basically areas of gray matter that are embedded in each cerebral hemisphere. They have multiple functions, dealing with coordination, some emotional aspects as well, for various types of feeling. But you see where the white matter is located right here. These darker areas are referred to as, these gray matter areas are referred to as, some of them, as the basal nuclei. The limbic system is also embedded areas of gray matter. You can see they have numerous names, like the parahippocampal gyrus, the amygdala. These are two fairly important ones. The olfactory bulb and tract, you see here. The corpus callosum contains tracts, and the cingulate nucleus right here. All of this, just to make it as simple as possible, some of these gray matter areas of the limbic system is what we call our emotional brain, and this is where we register certain types of emotions. So let's talk about the cerebrum a little bit more, and we'll get back to the limbic system in a minute. So the brain, the cerebrum I should say, the cerebral cortex, is functionally organized to control specific inputs and outputs. For instance, there are sensory areas in each one of the cerebral each one of the cerebral lobes that's involved in detecting particular type of stimulation. For instance, vision is in one place, auditory is in another one, smell, so forth and so on. The motor areas are also located in the cerebral cortex, involved in initiating reflexes that I'll mention here in a second. And then, association areas that allow us to make sense of sensory inputs for particular pieces of information. So if you eat an apple and you didn't know you were eating an apple and it tasted like an apple, you would picture an apple in your head. There's an association area that allows us to make those connections. So the association areas make connections so we can understand what is going on in our environment. So you don't have to go and learn all of these areas of the cerebrum and what happens in them, but there's a couple of areas of importance here. Number one, up here by the parietal lobes, we have what's called a pre-central gyrus and a post-central gyrus. This is the central sulcus in the middle. And the pre-central gyrus is referred to as our primary motor area. The primary motor area is the area of course, the cortex of the gyrus is the area where we generate motor information to go out to the skeletal muscles in the body to allow them to contract. So all of your skeletal muscle contraction, that information comes from the primary motor area. The post-central gyrus is what is referred to as our primary somatosensory area. So the primary somatosensory area is the area where we actually feel many types of sensations. Like if you stick your finger with a needle, it hurts and you feel it. You're going to feel it in a primary somatosensory area for your somatosensory inputs. All right. Now, the occipital lobe is where we have our primary visual cortex. So you're actually seeing this PowerPoint at the back of your cerebrum at the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe contains the primary auditory area, and so we can hear. We know we're hearing something from the primary auditory area in the temporal lobe. And then we have what's called the Broca's speech area, which is located in the lower parts of the parietal lobe and just at the area of our frontal lobe. The Broca's speech area is the area which allows us to actually form words. So typically if someone has a stroke and it affects this area of the brain, the Broca's speech area, they can understand you when you are speaking to them, but they can't form words correctly to communicate back to you when this area is damaged. All right, so here are just some basic functions of the cerebrum. Just, go over it. This is pretty generic, but I mentioned the limbic system earlier. The limbic system basically registers and promotes reflexes for various types of emotion, which include pleasure, pain, docility, affection, fear, and anger. These types of emotions are registered, and reflexes associated with them are registered at the limbic system. Now, I left this slide in here just so you could go and look at, I don't know if you ever heard of somebody saying I'm right-brained or left-brained. I'm not going to necessarily put this information on our test, but I left it in here so you can go and review it, because it is somewhat interesting about right-brained individuals and what goes on in the right brain, like music and artists have a well-developed right cerebral hemisphere. The left brain individuals are more into logical and scientific and math and all of that. So left-brained individuals or right-brained individuals, and some people have the best of both worlds. They have really developed areas in both the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. So you can just review that for your interest. Now, the last thing that you're going to be covering in this chapter are the cranial nerves. I know there's a lot of information on the cranial nerves, but I just want to let you know that you need to know the 12 pair of cranial nerves by name and number. And the numbers are Roman numerals. There are 12 pair of cranial nerves. All right, so I have a couple of these tables with the information in it that you need, and you need to know if the cranial nerve has sensory neurons in it, which means they have a sensory function, and sensory neurons obviously carry information into the brain, or if they have a motor function. And a motor function obviously is where the neurons are carrying information or action potentials away from the brain. And then some neurons have a mixed component where they have some neurons that are sensory and some neurons that are motor. So some neurons are carrying information in and some are carrying information out. So I want you to know which ones are sensory, which ones are motor, and which ones are both. And their principal function. For instance, the first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve. It's involved in the sensation of smell. Cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, is involved in vision, so forth and so on. So I want you to know the functions from these tables. So here are the first 8 cranial nerves. Here are the 9 through 12 with their name and their number. So again, you need to know their name and number. You're going to have to know this for your lab if you're taking lab anyway. If it's sensory or motor, and what their principal function is. Now, I'll put in here a mnemonic, which is in your book, but you could look any number of mnemonics up to remember the cranial nerves. This one is O, to touch and feel very green vegetables, ah. And the first letter on each one of those words is the first letter of the name of the cranial nerve. One that I learned when I was in your place a long time ago is kind of silly, but I still remember it to this day. I thought the instructor was kind of silly with it, but let's see if I can remember. It goes, on old Olympus towering tops. Let me start over. On old Olympus towering tops, a Finn viewed Germans viewing a hawk. So I know that's kind of silly, but you know what? I still remember it. So you can learn any number of mnemonics to learn the number and the name of the cranial nerve. I just need you to learn it. The last things that are in the PowerPoint are links to go and look at animations. So here's one for the overview of everything that we covered, and then I have one for each one of the cranial nerves, all the way down to cranial nerve number 12. So you, whoops, sorry about that. So you can go and review those, all right? So if you have any questions, email me and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And good luck studying.